But you don't want to go back down there, right?
It's not, they vest in their stock. I'll talk to you.
Okay.
Silence.
Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the Rayburn Room. Welcome back to the House side, to the distinguished leader, Democratic leader of the Senate, Senator Schumer. I'm glad that he is joined by the distinguished senator from Vermont, a former chair of the Judiciary Committee, a leader on the Appropriations Committee, and one of the newest members of the Senate Democratic Caucus, Senator Jones of Alabama. Welcome to the House side, to all of you. Thank you. We're glad you're here with us. One of the people who was there in 2006 when we wrote the most recent, soon-to-be less than most recent Voting Rights Act in 2006 was John Lewis. He was at the table when that bill was written. He was on the steps of the Capitol when we marched down. Remember, Steny, House and Senate, Democrats and Republicans, with over 300 votes in the House, unanimous vote in the Senate for the Voting Rights Act signed by President Bush. John Lewis was there for the writing, for the celebration, for the signing. But John Lewis was also there 54 years ago. This weekend will be the anniversary of the march for over 50 years, as we know, the Voting Rights Act has enshrined into law the sacred right to be heard at the ballot box, and now it is under threat. As we gather here today, let us salute the relentless leadership of Representative Terry Sewell of Alabama on the historic legislation to advance justice. And we commend Congresswoman Marcia Fudge for her leadership holding hearings around the country, starting in Brownsville, Texas. This is an issue that crosses in terms of the African-American community, the Asian Pacific American community represented by Judy Chu here, and the Hispanic community represented by Ben Ray Lujan here, but they represent not only their communities, but all of America's communities. Again, more than 50 years ago, this took place under the presidency of Lyndon Johnson, but inspired by students who were the inspiration for the march, and then thousands of men and women, inspired by the students, marched from Selma to lay the claim for the most fundamental right in our democracy. We must finish the long march to progress, passing H.R. 4 to protect the ballot and advance justice for all. The Voting Rights Advancement Act will restore the Voting Rights Act's ability to combat voter discrimination across America. And again, liberty and justice for all. It's a pledge we take to the flag every day. I'm privileged to yield to our distinguished visitor, former member of the House. I keep reminding
Only 18 years.
But now happily ensconced as the Democratic leader of the Senate, Senator Schumer. Welcome back, Senator Schumer. Welcome back.
Well, thank you, Speaker Pelosi, and I want to thank all of the members here. Terry Sewell, who has done so much in this regard and comes from that historic territory where John Lewis marched, and everyone else who was here. My colleagues on the Senate side, of course, our great ranking member, hopefully soon to be chair again of Judiciary, Pat Leahy, Doug Jones, who's been a leader in civil rights and voting rights throughout his career, long before he got to the Senate, and all of course, my friends from the House. There is nothing more bedrock to America than the right to vote. There is nothing more despicable in America than trying to deny that right to vote. And that's what too many have done in too many places, not 50 years ago and not 10 years ago, but right now as we speak. It's disgraceful. And when the Supreme Court did Shelby, one of the three worst decisions of the Roberts Court, the others being Citizens United and Janus, in my opinion, they said there's no more discrimination. We don't need this anymore, Section 5. And then what happened? 19 states, some of them actually saying in emails that they believed in bigotry and discrimination, started taking away the right to vote. This is one of the most needed pieces of legislation. that we have. I know it will pass under the great leadership of the people we see here in the House, and we are going to do everything to persuade our Republican colleagues, because this is an American bill, not a Democratic or Republican bill, to pass it in the Senate. Thank you.
Well, welcome. This is what democracy looks like. Democracy is about inclusion. And what the Shelby decision did was to break down the enforceability of the Voting Rights Act of 1965. Well, we're all here today to say no more. The House and Senate Democrats are going to ensure that we are working on behalf of the people. The people's agenda really does depend upon its democracy. And the base of the democracy is the right to vote. After all, your vote is your voice, and no one's voice should be silenced in this democracy. I want to thank the leadership of Speaker Pelosi. I want to thank the Senate, Senator Leahy, who is going to introduce this bill on the Senate side. I'd also like to thank the Tri-Caucus that has always stood with us strong. The Congressional Black Caucus, led ably by Karen Bass, thank you very much. Also, Judy Chu, who leads the Congressional Pacific Asian Caucus, as well as, I know Ben Ray Lujan is here representing the Congressional Hispanic Caucus. I also know that there are lots of groups who have really helped us make sure that the Voting Rights Advancement Act gets passed, and that has helped us create a steady drumbeat. Because at the end of the day, the 2013 decision, the Shelby decision, really did, while it did not invalidate Section 5, which was enforceability, it invalidated Section 4. And so by invalidating Section 4, which was the mechanism by which you chose what states and jurisdictions should seek preclearance, it really thwarted and gutted the enforceability of the Voting Rights Act of 1965. So as we gather on the eve of the 54th anniversary of the Selma to Montgomery March, and we will cross that bridge one more time with John Lewis over this weekend. Steny, you'll be there as well. And we just really want to say that we understand what the American people asked for when they voted us back into the majority. They wanted an agenda that was for the people. For the people. And what's more basic than the Voting Rights Act of 1965 and making sure that we are protecting the right of all Americans to vote? Perhaps there's no better example of that than the 2018 midterm elections, where we saw in Georgia the person who was running for governor, who was also the Secretary of State, purge more than 53,000 voters from the rolls, a majority of which were African American. We saw in North Dakota a state legislature that required for registration that you have a physical address, knowing that Native Americans mostly use P.O. boxes. We saw in 2018 the most pernicious effects of voter suppression, and we said no more. The Voting Rights Advancement Act is Congress's answer to putting the teeth back into the Voting Rights Act of 1965. I want to thank the groups that are here represented today who have been stalwart advocates on behalf of all Americans' right to vote. The Leadership Conference, the Lawyers Committee, the National Council of Jewish Women, the National Urban League, the Asian American Advancing Justice, ACLU, the Brennan Center, former judiciary staff, Daniel Initiatives, the Transformative Justice Coalition, the Advancement Project, and so many more. I really want to thank everyone who's here today, because we are ensuring that justice and democracy is fully inclusive. I also want to invite Congressman Lewis, who I guess stands really as a symbol of what we are all fighting for when we think about his courage on that bridge so many years ago. Representative Lewis, it's an honor to not only call you a colleague, but to call you a friend. So please come forward.
Terry Sewell, my home girl. Thank you for those kind words. Thank you, Madam Speaker, for hosting each and every one of us. Thank you for your service. Thank you for your work. Thank you for never giving up or giving in, but for keeping the faith. Voting access is the key to equality in our democracy. The size of your wallet The number on your zip code shouldn't matter. The action of government affects every American, so every citizen should have an equal voice. And when that happens, politicians have to recognize the dignity and the worth of every human being. We all count. It doesn't matter whether you're black or white, Latino, Asian American, or Native American. We're one people. We're one family. We all live in the same house, the American house. And there are forces in America today trying to take us back to another time and to another period. We've come too far and made too much progress to go back. With this piece of legislation, we will continue to go forward. No more counting the number of bubbles on a bar of soap. No more counting the number of jelly beans in a jar. No more long lines. Open up the political process and let the people come in. That's what democracy is all about. We must do it. We must pass this bill and pass it now. So thank you. Thank you.
Senator Leahy.
Thank you, Speaker Pelosi. You know, I have to think when I listen to my dear friend John Lewis speak and all the rest of you, I'm fortunate that I come from a state that believes in people voting, everybody voting. And as a result, we have one of the biggest turnouts ever in percentage. But I'm also from a state where we study history. And I read the history of the road. I read about Bloody Sunday. And one of my things that thrilled me the most after I came to the Senate was getting to meet and know John Lewis. And John, I've been touched so many times, and you called me your brother. I can't tell you how much that means. But we're all brothers and sisters. And we've got to have Voting Rights Advancement Act. We've got to do it. We've got to overturn the Shelby County. We can't tell our citizens you're part of this country, but you can't vote. And we happen to know how. Well, my state is fortunate. But I look at my friend Doug Jones. I look at others in states where they find creative ways, sometimes not even creative, obscene ways to stop people from voting. So, Speaker Pelosi, thank you for being here. Thank you for doing this. I'm going back to my caucus now. I'm going to pound on everybody. We're going to get this done. We have to get it done. The Shelby County decision was wrong. We are right. Let Americans vote in America. Thank you.
Bravo. Thank you.
Thank you, Senator Leahy. It is my pleasure to be here with my colleagues today to begin the process of restoring Section 4 of the Voters' Rights Act. And I want to emphasize that because I think that we've heard a lot in recent last couple of years about voters' fraud, something nobody has been able to find. But what we have seen displayed very openly and publicly has been elections fraud. That's what we saw in Georgia with the Secretary of State running for governor, overseeing his own purging. That's what we just saw in North Carolina. What can be more evident of what's wrong with our system than to see election officials elected and appointed and hired to suppress votes. What we hear today is to begin the process of developing the record that will be used by the Congress to determine whether or not Section 4 ought to be reformalized and to what extent it should be, as to what communities and what states will be covered. We'll begin in the process. And we thank the Supreme Court for at least saying in its opinion that we ought to take a look at the formula and update it. And that's why we're here today, to update that formula. And it ain't going to be too hard from what we have seen over the last several months. And with that, let me yield to my friend, my longtime friend, our Majority Leader, Senator Hoyer.
Thank you so much, Jim Clyburn. Advocate, thank you very much for daily raising the flag, raising the voice. Senator Jones, we're so proud of you. Shelby County, of course, is in Alabama. John Lewis and I, and Barbara, you going, and some of the rest of you may be going, to visit Terry's town called Selma. I don't know how many of you watched the Academy Awards ceremony. I don't know how many of you saw the movie Green Book. I don't know how many of you saw John Lewis present at the Academy Awards. There were a whole lot of famous, very rich people there. And when John Lewis came to the stage, they all stood and applauded, the longest applause of anybody who appeared at the Academy Awards. He was talking about the Green Book. The Green Book, it was about the South in the not-too-distant future. Past. RBG. Ruth Bader Ginsburg. In Shelby versus Holder, the case that we are trying to correct now 54 years after John Lewis walked across a bridge. I've walked across it with him 15 times as of this weekend. Ruth Bader Ginsburg in the Shelby case said that the majority's opinion was like having an umbrella. And because they weren't getting wet, they took it down. And then, Doug, a whole lot of folks got wet real quick. They got rained upon by the exclusionary actions in North Carolina, in Texas, in other states. This bill is about redeeming the promise that was made by Lyndon Johnson in the Congress of the United States in August of 1965 as a direct result of John Lewis almost losing his life along with 599 other people walking across the Edmund Pettus Bridge to do what? To go to Montgomery, Alabama. To do what? To register. Not to threaten, not to demonstrate, not to do anything, to register to vote. I am so proud to be a co-sponsor of this bill. I am so grateful that Terry Sewell, the favorite daughter of Selma, and John Lewis, the favorite son of America, co-sponsored this bill with all of us. We need to put that umbrella back up. As Ruth Bader Ginsburg said, to make sure that no one's right to vote is rained on. Thank you. Who's next?
Senator Jones.
Senator Jones. Senator Doug Jones, who has, as Chuck Schumer said and Nancy Pelosi said, has been a fighter for civil rights all his life in the state of Alabama. We are so proud of you, Doug Jones.
Thank you.
Yes, sir.
Thank you, Congressman. And it's so great to be here with colleagues from the House, with the Senate, but especially my great friend Terry Sewell, and applaud her for all her work on this important legislation, and my great friend and hero, John Lewis, for all that he has done, not only in the Congress, but walking across that bridge 54 years ago. I'm really proud to be here, though, quite frankly, as a proud son of the South, a son of the state of Alabama who has its own sordid history when it comes to voting rights. And everyone knows that history, and we're not alone. That history was shared by a lot of different people. So I'm proud to be here today to lend my voice to this important effort. You know, people talk about voting as a fundamental right and a basic tenet. Well, it's not just a right. It's a duty. It's a duty that we all have as American citizens to vote, to exercise, to have a voice in this government. And what's interesting to me is that we hear so many political leaders today talking about how we have to up that voting population. We have to get more people to the polls. We have to get the percentage of the voting population to actually get to the polls. But those same politicians will continue to deny people the opportunity to exercise their duty as American citizens. They call it that this bill is somehow a power grab. Oh, for goodness sakes. If there is a power grab at all, it is among those who would deny people the right to vote. If it's a power grab at all, it's among those who would restrict access to the ballot box and not give people free and unfettered right to exercise not just their right, but their duty. That's what we're here about. That's exactly what we're here about today, to add the voices that so many that want to get out there, that need to be out there. We want to build up the American voices to exercise that voice every time they have an opportunity, whether it is in a local election or a presidential election. I believe, and I believe very strongly, that it is our duty as lawmakers to encourage participation in our American democracy, this incredible experiment that has been going on for so long, and to remove any barrier that we can that would prevent people from voting. The Voting Rights Advancement Act of 2019 is an essential step forward to fulfilling that duty. And I would urge my colleagues on both sides of the aisle to support this bill and strengthen this great democracy. Thank you all for letting me be a part of this today. Thank you.
Chairman Nadler.
Well, thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here. Restoring the vitality of the Voting Rights Act should be a major bipartisan objective of this Congress. The introduction of the Voting Rights Advancement Act by Representative Sewell is the first step to meeting this objective, and I am honored to be an original co-sponsor. It's been said quite truthfully that the right to vote is protective of all other rights, that without that right, you're at the mercy of everyone else. Little history is in order here. Before 1965, African Americans basically were prevented from voting in many states of the Union, and so were others elsewhere. And a state legislature would enact a law designed to prevent people from voting, and someone would sue against the constitutionality of that law. And 2 or 3 elections would go by with people not voting, with not being able to vote, and then the law would be declared unconstitutional, and the legislature would pass another law. And the same thing would happen, and people would never get to register to vote, as the legislature or the city council played whack-a-mole with the right to vote for people. Then in 1965, after the March on Selma, after all the agitation that was done, Congress finally fixed the problem by passing Section 5 and Section 4 of the Voting Rights Act. And Section 5 required that for jurisdictions, states, counties, whoever, with a history of discrimination in voting, with a history of suppressing the vote, they couldn't change any law or regulation respecting voting without prior approval of the Justice Department in Washington or the Federal District Court in Washington. And that stopped the problem. That solved the problem. The registration rates jumped up. Political power suddenly was available to black citizens in the South and to other people in other places. And we had to renew the Voting Rights Act several times. In 2006, I had the honor, along with Steve Shabbat, of presiding over hundreds of hours of hearings in this Constitution Subcommittee to develop a 15,000-page record on the basis of which Congress renewed the Voting Rights Act for 25 years by a vote of 390, I think, to 5 in the House in 2006. Bipartisan vote, obviously. But then came Shelby County. And what did Shelby County say in 2013? They said that, things had changed. Areas where discrimination had occurred, discrimination wasn't occurring anymore. As was said before by Chuck, you weren't getting, or quoting Ruth Bader Ginsburg, you weren't getting wet, so you don't need the umbrella. So they said that Section 4, which determined which jurisdictions, which states, which localities were subject to the Section 5 preclearance requirements, was unconstitutional because it was out of date, because it was based on 1964 history. If you discriminated in 1964, you were subject to it. And this was ancient history, and we don't need it anymore. But if you could show, based on a more modern test, then you could do it again. So the court practically invited Congress to pass a new Section 4 based on more modern tests. And that is what this bill does. This bill, and the moment Shelby was decided, we started the game of whack-a-mole all over again. And 19 states enacted various restrictive laws, and you see what's going on. The law is designed with surgical precision against African-American voters in North Carolina, a court said. A court said that. It threw it out after several elections had gone by. And so they enacted another law, and that kept going. We've got to stop the game of whack-a-mole, as was done in 1965, by reenacting a new Section 4 so that Section 5 preclearance can be the law again. That's what this bill does. This bill should pass unanimously. It won't, but it should. We will be having, the Judiciary Committee will be having a series of oversight hearings to build, along with Marcia Fudge's hearings, a strong record to support an effective trigger for Section 5, because the Supreme Court tells us we've got to build up a big record. We will do that. And then the House will pass, and hopefully the Senate will join it in passing the Voting Rights Advancement Act introduced by Representative Sewell, and will finally say that the shame of voter suppression, which we thought we were doing away with in 1965, we are in fact doing away with now. Thank you.
Thank you. I'm Judy Chu, and as chair of the Congressional Asian Pacific American Caucus, I'm proud to join my colleagues in supporting the Voting Rights Advancement Act, and I want to thank my colleague, Congressmember Terry Sewell, for her incredible effort in leading this bill. We're here because of the Supreme Court's Shelby County versus Holder decision. And as Asian Pacific Islanders, we know all too well what's at stake when we are denied our seat at the table. For 60 years, Chinese Americans were denied the ability to vote because of the Chinese Exclusion Act, which denied them the right to naturalize citizens. But we've also had trouble having equal access at the voting booth. Asian Americans have had voter disenfranchisement tactics instilled upon them, discriminatory voter ID laws, voter intimidation, and efforts to refuse language assistance at the polls. This has resulted in some AAPIs being unable to vote because they could not read the ballot. Hearing that any eligible voter was kept from the polls should be chilling to anybody who cares about our democracy, and it should be a call for action. Generations before us have fought long and hard to protect access to the ballot box so that we could have a voice in our democracy. Today, with the introduction of the VRAA, we are fighting to protect that voice. And now, I'd like to turn the podium over to my colleague, Congressmember Ben Ray Lujan from New Mexico.
Thank you, Judy.
Our Assistant Speaker.
Thank you, Terry. Well, good afternoon, everyone. Terry Sewell, thank you so much for the work you've done day in and day out, leading this initiative since the day you were elected and days before that. Terry's not let go of this, and she shouldn't, nor should any one of us across America. Look, this comes down to understanding that voting is a fundamental right for Americans, understanding that a vote gives us all equal voice in our democracy. But we've seen time and again how the right to vote has been undermined and attacked. What this comes down to is understanding that there is nothing more cynical than looking to silence Americans for political purposes. We've seen it happen. Most recently in North Carolina, in North Dakota, in Georgia. Cases that are bringing attention to Latinos being undermined in the state of Texas. That's why I'm proud to be supporting the Voting Rights Advancement Act, an essential first step in restoring the right to vote. I also want to thank Congresswoman Terry Sewell and the Committee on Elections for working with me and with Native American voting rights advocates on the Native American Voting Rights Act. It's time for Congress to move forward, for the Senate to join the House, and the will of the American people to be heard. Terry, thank you for your incredible work, and I now turn this back to the lead sponsor of this important initiative, our incredible leader, Terry Sewell.
So to close out, I want to again thank those who are the steady drumbeat for voting rights in America, our amazing voting rights advocates. These groups have really been the drumbeat for so many of us. I know that we all want to take a picture with John Lewis, so I'm going to close this out by just simply saying, Shelby decision really issued a challenge to Congress, the Supreme Court did, for us to come up with a Section 4 that was modern day, a modern day formula. And our efforts are now to show that without Shelby, it's been pretty easy to see what state legislatures have been doing across this country without the protection, the full protections of the Voting Rights Act. They have been suppressing the right to vote in the name of fraud, voter fraud, in the name of not having enough resources. They're closing down polling locations. In the name of ostensibly making it fundamentally easier to vote. They are indeed making it harder to vote. So we stand together today, and we introduce, along with 200 plus members of the House today, the Voting Rights Advancement Act. I am very proud and want to acknowledge my great staff who came up with these great buttons and all the wonderful work that we're all doing. But this is just a drumbeat. This legislation, in order to become law, must pass the Senate, the House, the Senate, and be signed by a president. And currently, we have an environment that's hostile to doing what we can do to make it easier for people to vote. We have to acknowledge that too many states have gone unchecked. That's why we have court decisions like that in North Carolina that said that they had crafted a law, a state law, with precision, surgical precision, that was done to exclude African Americans. And in the state of Texas, they're still battling. So I think it's so important that we all acknowledge that there is a problem and that we're here to fix it. We believe that the Voting Rights Advancement Act is that fresh start. It's a 25-year look back, not to the days of 1960, not to the days of the 40s, but 1994 going forward. And we're going to look to see those states that have been egregious actors. I want to thank all of those who have participated in today's presser, and onward and upward. We're on our way to Selma this weekend, and we look forward to continuing to press for the voices of the excluded, because after all, that's what Restore the Vote stands for. We're restoring the vote, the voices of the excluded. Thank you all. Let's take a quick picture.